If we can, if this Senate and this House would give us the chance, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President. The senior senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, before the senator from New York departs, I want to say this is a real-life example in Pinellas County, Florida, which is the county that houses St. Petersburg and Clearwater. Current flood insurance premium of a homeowner, $4,000. New flood insurance premium, 10 times, $44,000. Now, do you think that that homeowner can afford that? And do you think that that homeowner can now sell their house, since that is the flood insurance premium that is facing a potential buyer, and of course the real estate market dries up? And so it's a question of affordability, and I would merely underscore what the senator has already said and what the great senator from Louisiana is going to talk about, and that is you have a pause, you get FEMA to do an affordability study, and then you phase this thing in over time. Now, it just so happens that 40% of these policies are in my state of Florida. We have more coastline than any other state, save for Alaska, and they're not afflicted by the same things that we are, and they don't have a population of 20 million people. And lo and behold, our people are hurting, and we've got to give them relief. So I beg anybody in the Senate, please, when this unanimous consent request comes up, we have to have this relief for our homeowners and for the real estate market. Now, the maps are a different question, and eventually we need to address the issue of the maps, because they are obviously drawing some areas that are not flood prone. They're well above the flood stage, and somehow these maps have gotten misaligned. We can address that, but right now we've got to address the affordability question. This is no fooling time, and I beg the Senate to let this legislation go by unanimous consent, and I am anxious to have my colleagues make their statements. Mr. President, I am chairing the Aging Committee hearing right now. Look forward to the senator from Massachusetts joining us after her statement. So with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senior senator from New Jersey is recognized.
President, in deference to my colleague who I understand may object, and although I have a statement, let me first precede it by saying I want to ask, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader, after consultation with the Republican leader, the Banking Committee be discharged from further consideration of S. 1610, the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2013, that the Senate proceed to its consideration, that an amendment which is at the desk making technical changes to the bill be agreed to, that no other amendments be in order to the bill, that there be up to 2 hours of debate equally divided between proponents and opponents of the bill, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the bill be read a third time and the Senate proceed to vote on passage of the bill, and finally that the vote on passage be subject to a 60 vote affirmative threshold.
Is there objection? Senator from Kansas.
On behalf of the ranking member of the Banking Committee, this bill has not been through the committee process, would undo the important rate reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program that were put in place in the most recent flood reform bill to address the program's $25 billion debt to the taxpayer. We must ensure that all members have the opportunity to understand and weigh in on the changes being made by this bill. This unanimous consent request would bypass this important step in the legislative process, and I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I have to say I'm disappointed to hear objection because this is a bipartisan effort that is being pursued here in the Senate, and the Majority Leader has been very gracious to offer us time to debate and vote on an important proposal, and I'm sure we'll be back here again to try to achieve that. This isn't a Republican bill or a Democratic bill. It's not a Republican or Democratic priority. It's a common-sense measure that has broad bipartisan support, exactly the type of support and cooperation the American people are yearning to see from their elected officials. And more importantly, this legislation is critical to the lives of hundreds of thousands of homeowners. And I would hope that we shouldn't let just simply Senate procedure get in the way of finding solutions. Now, let me just briefly speak in support of S. 1610, which is the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act that we just had consent to bring to the floor. It's a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that would help people afford flood insurance so they can stay in their homes and businesses can stay open, all the while preventing property values from plummeting. At a time when there's far too little bipartisan cooperation, this bill stands as a notable exception. It currently is co-sponsored by 23 of my colleagues, including 7 Republicans, including states from all corners of the country. It's supported by the National Association of Realtors, the National Association of Home Builders, the American Bankers Association, the Independent Community Bankers Association. And you've heard from several of my colleagues that have spoken to this, and there are others like Senator Warren and my fellow colleague from New Jersey, Senator Booker, I'm proud to say has chosen this bill as the first piece of legislation to co-sponsor what I'm sure will be a long and illustrious career in the Senate. The reason for that broad support is because flood insurance isn't just a coastal or northeast issue. It's an issue that affects the entire country. Every state in the nation has properties covered by the National Flood Insurance Program, and every state in the nation will see premiums on some of these properties increase as a result of bigot waters. Now, some of these increases will be modest. Others are going to be prohibitively expensive and act as a de facto eviction notice for homeowners who have lived in their homes and played by the rules their entire lives. We certainly know this because we're already hearing from our constituents, and many more colleagues are hearing the same desperate cries from across the country, and many more will hear them as flood insurance maps get outlined by FEMA under the legislation, as renewals come up, and all of a sudden they're going to hear an outcry from their homeowners who are going to say, this ultimately creates a set of circumstances for me where I'm going to lose my home. Their value of their homes will be dramatically reduced, their ability to sell it will be dramatically altered, and they will in essence have taken what they've worked a lifetime to achieve and have it become a human catastrophe made by the United States Congress. This is going to drive property values down, the housing market's still struggling to recover, and we all know that declining property values have a domino effect affecting neighborhood properties to decline in value, which in turn hurts the broader economy. We need to understand the impact that these dramatic changes in bigot waters will have on the housing market before it's too late. We need to understand the impact these rate reforms will have on program participation, which is already dismally low. In fact, recent reports suggest that only about 18% of properties in flood zone participate in the program. If rates are raised too high and too quickly, people will simply opt to drop their insurance, decreasing participation, and the risk pool on the National Flood Insurance Program will ultimately find the consequences of that. One study has shown that for every 10% increase in premiums, program participation decreases by approximately 2.6%. And the sharper increases, the higher the proportion of dropouts. As with any flood insurance fund, the smaller the risk pool, the greater the risk. So increasing rates could have the unintended consequences of actually making the program less solvent. Reduced program participation would also increase the amount taxpayers are on the hook for in disaster assistance payments. And since FEMA grants, SBA loans, and disaster assistance are reserved for unmet needs, more uninsured homeowners mean more disaster assistance payoff. We should be incentivizing people to purchase insurance so they have skin in the game and they'll be motivated to take proactive mitigation measures, not pricing them out of insurance so they're forced to rely on taxpayer-funded disaster assistance. And now there's no question that we need to reform the National Flood Insurance Program in order to put it on a long-term path towards solvency and sustainability. But unfortunately, Biggert Waters forces changes that are far too large and far too fast. It requires FEMA to increase rates dramatically even before FEMA knows the scope of these changes or how they'll impact program participation. Think about that for a second. We're making dramatic changes in policy which could impact more than 5.5 million policyholders, have ripple effects throughout the housing market and our entire economy before we even know the extent of these changes or their impact. Now, I've heard from countless New Jerseyans, many have come to me in tears, who are facing this predicament. These are hard-working, middle-class families, played by the rules, purchased flood insurance responsibly, and are now being priced out of their homes. And that's why we've collectively introduced the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act that would impose a moratorium on the phase-out of subsidies and grandfathers included in Biggert Waters for most primary residences until FEMA completes the study that was authored, that I offered as an amendment that was included in the legislation, completes the affordability study that was mandated in the law and proposes a regulatory framework to address the issues found in the study. So we're going ahead with all of these actions and all these increases without knowing the consequences of that study. It would also require FEMA to certify in writing that it has implemented a flood mapping approach that utilizes sound scientific and engineering methodologies before certain rate reforms are implemented. We saw this in New Jersey, where in fact large swaths of communities were put in what we call the V zone, which is the most consequential zone in the opening maps, only that when we pressed FEMA and brought information to them, those universes were dramatically reduced. The difference between being in that V zone and not can mean the difference between being able to continue to own your home or not. And so we believe that this legislation is critical. Now, why do we come and ask unanimous consent? And I ask unanimous consent to include the rest of my statement in the record in deference to my colleagues who have been gracious enough, Senator Graham and others, have been gracious enough to let us intercede here before they rise to speak. So I'd like to have my full statement included in the record.
Objection, so ordered.
Why do we ask unanimous consent? Why did we ask unanimous consent? Why will we continue to ask unanimous consent? Because there is an urgency of now. If we do not act and we go out of session and we come back next year, unless we get to this early on and make it retroactive, we are going to see the consequences of this take place across the landscape of this country. And that's why you have members from coast to coast. That's why you have members from the South. That's why you have members from the Midwest who all understand the consequences of not acting. And that's why we've taken the unusual step on a bipartisan basis to ask for that unanimous consent request. Let me close, Mr. President, by asking, we have 4 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and they be printed in the record.
Without objection. So
With that,
ordered.
Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senior Senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. President, thank you so much. There's several other members. Senator Menendez is the leader of our effort. He and Senator Isaacson have joined together and have put together an extraordinary coalition. I'd like just to read the names into the record for just a moment because it's a testimony in a place that can't get 3 members to agree on anything. We have over 20 members to agree to change the Biggert Waters law. And I want to read into the record and then ask through the chair for the senator from Massachusetts. Both senators are here. Senior Senator, to be recognized for just a moment, and then the junior senator to speak on this issue. But Senator Menendez and Senator Isaacson are our lead. Again, New Jersey, Georgia, 2 very different states, but very similar challenges. They have people, middle-class families, small business owners that have poured their life savings into homes and businesses only to be destroyed by a piece of legislation that had great intentions but disastrous results. And we don't have a lot of time to fix this. We need to do this before this body leaves, which is next week. Myself, I'm on the bill, of course, Senator Cochran, Senator Merkley, Senator Vitter, Senator Hoeven, Senator Scott from South Carolina, Senator Wicker, Senator Heitkamp from North Dakota, Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Markey from Massachusetts, of course, Senator Warren from Massachusetts, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Nelson from Florida, Senator Baggage from Alaska, Senator Manchin from West Virginia. There's no ocean anywhere near West Virginia, but they have many middle-class families that are getting caught up in a quagmire here, and this bill is the only bill that can release them and save taxpayer money. Bob Casey from Pennsylvania, Amy Klobuchar, of course, our new senator we're very proud of, who's on the floor helping us, Senator Booker, Senator Hagan, and Senator Lindsey Graham, who's also on the floor, and our newest co-sponsor today, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. This is a very unusual coalition. I've been here a long time now. I've hardly seen a coalition this broad and diverse, so clearly we have something meaningful to say that needs change, and please let us not let procedures and pride and, I don't know, just bad tempers keep us from doing what we know we need to do for our people. So I want to just thank Senator Warren, who's been just a tremendous help to us in putting this bill together. Might I add that it cost nothing. There's no score on this bill. So anyone that could object because it costs the taxpayers, nada. It doesn't cost anything. It is a zero score. We've done it that way to be respectful of all different opinions, but it will help to give us relief. And through the chair, I'd like to ask Senator Warren to add her terrific voice and perspective on how it's affecting Massachusetts, one of our most important states.
Senior Senator from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Landry. I rise today to join my colleagues in urging support for 1610, the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2013. This is a bipartisan bill that will help homeowners across our country who are getting hit with the newly revised flood maps and increased flood insurance premiums. I am very pleased to join colleagues on both sides of the aisle to call for this common sense delay, which gives FEMA time to get this right. And I thank Senator Menendez, who has been a terrific leader on this, Senator Isaacson, Senator Landrieu, who has gotten in there and gotten us all mobilized, Senator Cochran, many others of the co-sponsors on this bill for their leadership and their commitment to work on this important issue. I also want to thank my partner in all things, Senator Markey, for the work that he has done on this bill and for giving me the chance to speak first here so we could get going. Families purchase flood insurance to prevent the loss of their homes. But now many families fear that the price of flood insurance could be just as devastating as any storm. You can't protect someone's home by pricing them out of it. Yet that's exactly what's taking place around the country. Congress changed the National Flood Program to move toward a more market-based system that more accurately reflects the true costs and risks of flood damage. This is a well-intentioned bill, but unfortunately homeowners are being blindsided by high rate increases and new flood zone maps. Many families are learning for the first time from news reports and letters that their mortgage companies are sending that they must purchase flood insurance. This is simply not an acceptable way of informing the public that flood insurance bills are skyrocketing. Now, when FEMA released these flood maps this year and last, they knew they were placing hundreds of thousands of homeowners into a flood zone for the very first time. It's critical that these maps be spot on and correct, but many people don't trust many of the new changes, and their concerns are growing by the day. In fact, a recent independent review conducted by coastal scientists at the behest of my colleague, Congressman Bill Keating, concluded that FEMA used outdated wave methodology better suited for the Pacific coast when they drafted new flood maps for Massachusetts. They believe this resulted in FEMA over-predicting the flooding that could occur from once-in-a-century storms for much of our state. We need to pass this bill to give the government the time it needs to make sure that the maps are accurate, reliable, and reflect the best available scientific data. We also need to make sure that hardworking families who played by the rules can afford these policies. The Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act that I have proudly co-sponsored will provide relief to homeowners who built to code and were later remapped into a higher risk area. Furthermore, this critical bill will delay rate increases until FEMA completes the affordability study that was mandated by the Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act and until subsequent affordability guidelines are enacted. Homeowners are facing flood insurance premium increases that can cost $500, $1,000, even more per month. Most hardworking families and seniors don't have that kind of extra money on hand to spend on flood insurance premiums they never knew they were going to need. FEMA has a lot of work to do, and in the meantime, these families shouldn't be hit with high costs when they challenge the flood maps and win their appeals. Our bill will help address this injustice and will allow FEMA to utilize the National Flood Insurance Fund to reimburse people who successfully appeal a map determination. It also gives FEMA the added financial incentive to get those maps right the first time. I'm pleased to join colleagues on both sides of the aisle in this call for common sense delay, which will give FEMA time to get this right. I urge my Senate colleagues to support this much-needed relief for homeowners. I thank Senator Markey for his leadership. I thank Senator Landrieu for her amazing leadership in this, and for all my colleagues who are ready to move on something that is common sense and very much needed by families across this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back. I now yield to my colleague from Massachusetts, my partner, Ed Markey.
Senator from Massachusetts is recognized.
I thank the senator, and I thank her for her leadership. She and I have met with people all across the state of Massachusetts who are fearful for the impact that it can have upon their ability to live in their own homes, to sell their homes, to continue to operate their businesses, to sell their businesses. This is a fundamental issue for our state. Senator Warren and I, we bring this concern to the floor even as we know that it is a concern that is felt all across the country. It is Louisiana, it is New Jersey, it is South Carolina, it is West Virginia. It is the coastlines of our country. Yeah, it is. The warmer the climate becomes, is the warmer the oceans become. And the warmer the oceans, the higher the tide, the more devastating the storms, the changes that take place in terms of the impact upon the homes, the businesses all along the coastlines. But climate change just doesn't affect the coastal areas. It's affecting our whole country, the whole planet. There's a huge change which is taking place. That's why we're out here, ladies and gentlemen. We're out here because of climate change. Now, the storm that hit New Jersey, Hurricane Sandy, it was devastating, and we saw the courage of the people of New Jersey and New York in responding to that storm. But you know, just with a couple of changes in the direction of that storm, it could have wiped out everywhere from Cape Cod up to Newburyport, right through Maine, New Hampshire. But for a small change in that storm, it could have been down in Delaware, Virginia, wiping out that coastline. It's a there but for the grace of God, go the states that we represent here. And the same thing is true all across the country. We know that the pollution we pump into the sky heats the water in the air, and it gives storms more power. We know this scientifically. And with more powerful and more frequent storms, we realize that this tragedy is lapping right at the doors of every citizen. And we have to do something to prevent it from becoming worse. But at the same time, we also have to realize that these families are innocent victims. They did not have anything to do with a policy that did not deal with climate change for a generation, that ignored the science. They are now dealing with the consequences of a failure to deal with that issue. And we cannot allow the failure to act to be borne by those who are the least able to afford it. And that is what is happening. It is going to be innocent Americans who now have to suffer because we did not come to the political will to deal with this issue of climate change. And I've heard, along with Senator Warren, from people all over my state. I have one business that relocated several years ago, thinking that that was going to satisfy the need to protect against climate change, against the change in the floodplains. Now, under the new plan, they will have to move the business again. It's non-sustainable long-term for any business, any family to think about living in these kinds of areas unless we begin to think through how we are going to adjust to this law that is on the books, which will have an almost immediate impact upon families all over our country. So we need to fix the flood insurance provisions that would have devastating economic impacts on coastal communities, and that is why I am proud to support the legislation of the gentlelady from Louisiana, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Isaacson, Senator Menendez, Senator Merkley, everyone who has worked on this issue. We have to ensure that we have addressed the issue of affordability for these homeowners, affordability for these businesses in terms of the increase of the flood insurance rates caused by the new flood maps, and ensure that we put that before we add any additional crippling flood insurance rate increases to go into effect. We have to deal with affordability first. If affordability is not dealt with, then there is going to be a devastation that is felt by millions of homeowners and businesses across this country. Climate change is real. It is here. It is dangerous. But the fear of rising floodwaters should not be compounded by the fear of an unaffordable spike in insurance premiums for homeowners and businesses across this country. I thank my colleagues for all of their work on this issue. It is an indispensable part of the business of this Congress this year to pass this legislation. We have to find a way to work together before we leave in order to pass this legislation. And I call upon all of my colleagues to work together with us. This is as bipartisan as it gets in the United States Senate. We have to find a way. I congratulate the gentlelady from Louisiana for all of her great work, and I yield back.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I see the other senators on the floor wishing to speak, but I'd like to give some concluding remarks on this very important hour that we've spent on the floor talking about this important issue. We are down to the wire here, Mr. President. We do not have any time left to provide relief to homeowners and business owners all over this country. Now, about an hour ago, there was objection registered from the Republican ranking member of the Banking Committee. I have a great deal of respect for that particular member. I hope that he will consider the tragic ramifications of his objection for millions of homeowners and businesses around the country, and work with us over the next few days to mitigate any of his objections so that we can move this bill to the floor, provide 2 hours of debate, and we will accept, those of us in our coalition, a 60-vote threshold. Let me remind these colleagues that a hearing was held in the Banking Committee by Senator Merkley, who chairs the subcommittee. This bill has been discussed for hours and hours in committee, in public. There are hundreds of stakeholder groups led by, I'm very proud, G&O Inc., Greater New Orleans Inc., a broad coalition of business leaders, parish presidents, and they reached out across the country, down the coast, the Gulf Coast, to the East Coast, to the West Coast, to the good senator here from North Carolina, South Carolina, reaching out to their areas, and in the Midwest and up in the Northwest. Mr. President, the reason they did that is because there are new flood maps going into effect in all of these places. I'd call attention to the diagram here, flood maps in the United States. In purple, these were the flood maps that were in effect as of July 2012. In the green, these are proposed flood maps that have been introduced. You can see how many green designations there are. And in the goldish color here, new flood maps possible. There is no state that is going to escape these new flood maps. But as Elizabeth Warren said, Senator Warren, they are inaccurate. They don't have the capability, the finances, the resources to produce, or the technology in some cases, to produce accurate flood maps. There have been record number of mistakes that have been made that we have provided for the public testimony. In addition, I'd like to show a map of where levees are. There are many, many levees. I was surprised myself, having become an expert on levees. I thought, no, I'm not the expert that I thought I was, because I did not realize how many levees there were in other states, because I'd been so focused on mine that broke in 52 places and almost destroyed a great international and American city in New Orleans. So because we are on the mouth of the Mississippi River, of course I'm well aware of the levee system that was one of the great engineering feats ever in the world, on the planet, that keeps the Mississippi River in its channel so that we can have the great commerce we have that's helped build this nation. I am well aware of the great story beyond about that. But I was not aware of the tremendous flooding risk in California, in Arizona, in New Mexico, in Montana, of all places. Of course, I knew about Arkansas and Illinois, St. Louis here because of the Mississippi River all the way up to Minneapolis. But look at Pennsylvania. I was shocked myself to see so many flooding areas in the state of Pennsylvania. So I want to just say about this is just a coastal issue. It is not a coastal issue. It is a national issue. We're the National Congress. These rates are going up now. It needs to be fixed now. So I hope the Republican opposition will think clearly about their objection and the ramifications that it's going to have, and find a way to say yes. Find a way to say yes. The bill that Senator Menendez and Senator Isaacson are offering cost zero. And it helps millions of people and ultimately will make the program physically sound. Because as a senator from New York said so eloquently and so accurately, if you price people out of the program, there will be no one to support the program. The program will default. Taxpayers will still have to pick up the debt associated with that program. And then you will also have millions of people losing their homes and their businesses. It makes no sense. It makes no financial sense. Now, I am glad, and I'm not going to talk too much longer, but I do want to state this. I am very happy as an American that there are many newspapers that we can read, and now there are lots of blogs and lots of radio shows and all sorts of different opinions, because, you know, you have to read a lot and think a lot and get different views to really find the truth. So I'm going to read the first paragraph of the Wall Street Journal, because they need to listen to a couple of other either bloggers or writers because they are way off base. The Washington Post said last week, quote, "Federal flood insurance is a classic example of powerful government aiding the powerful, encouraging the affluent to build mansions near the shore." I mean, that statement is so inaccurate, it's laughable. Laughable. The people that I represent in Louisiana, we hardly have a beach. I don't know if anyone has visited Louisiana. We don't have beaches. We have marshes. And no one that I know that lives in New Orleans or Baton Rouge is anywhere near a beach. I want to read a letter from a very affluent and powerful person. I am a 66-year-old woman. I have lived in the same house in Broadmoor since 1974. I would know this letter that arrived at my desk because that's the neighborhood I grew up in and still reside. There's not a beach within miles of Broadmoor. She goes on to say, I live there with my family, raised a son who also lives and owns a house in Broadmoor, very middle-class neighborhood that we come from. I plan to stay in my home for the remainder of my life. I live on a very strict budget. I have just this month received my first Social Security payment after working my whole life. If something is not done to change the law that will potentially raise my flood insurance by the thousands, it will not be possible for me to keep my home or to sell it. I want the Wall Street Journal editorial board to hear this. This is not a millionaire in a mansion on a beach. This is a 66-year-old woman who just got her Social Security check, who, if this law is not changed by the 100 members of this body in the next few days, she can either stay in her house or sell her house. Now, please, do not lecture to us from some high place up in some big corporate office about us on the floor of the United States Senate trying to fight for powerful interests for people in mansions that live on fancy beaches. That is not what this bill is about. And I have hundreds of pictures. If the Wall Street Journal or any newspaper wants to editorialize about this, just go check my website, My Story, My Home. I have hundreds, and other senators have hundreds of pictures. I don't see a mansion on here. All I see are cries of people that say, wait a minute, my house has never flooded. I live in a simple neighborhood. I'm a simple person. I just am an American that works hard, and you're running me out of my home? Now, the bill that passed, Biggert-Waters, was well-intentioned, but it was drafted inappropriately, and it has some very pernicious guidelines or rules in it that can only be changed by Congress. Some people want to think that FEMA can just wave a magic wand and make it work. FEMA cannot wave a magic wand. We have to do our job as senators, and I hope the Senate will do its job. Now, we can't agree on everything that needs to be fixed around here. I understand that. There's lots of arguments about other things that some people think need to be fixed and others don't. But I don't know anyone or have heard anyone on this floor walk to the floor and give us one good, solid reason that the Menendez bill shouldn't pass. I don't like Section 1, I don't like Section 2, I don't like Section 10, maybe Section 5, not one. It's all just kind of posturing. Please, let's get over the posturing and help people that live nowhere near a beach who are going to lose their homes, who need us to act. I believe that we can do it. As I said, we have great Republican leadership on this and great Democratic leadership. I have to say in closing, the senator on the floor has my great respect, but also Senator Isaacson, who is the lead Republican senator on this, is known in this body as an expert on real estate and finance. He is very, very clear in his appreciation and understanding that the real estate market is going to be shaken to its core, as well as home builders and community bankers that are holding mortgages on these 5 million properties. We've come too far, we've come too long to restore this housing market, to let this bill that was well-intentioned but really poorly drafted, stuck into a conference committee report at the last minute, not with as much oversight as we should have given it. We can fix this. Let's do it. So I thank the senator for being so generous. It's a very important issue, and I'm, prepared to stay here for as long as it takes before Christmas, even, I hate to say, up to Christmas Eve, which I'd really like to try to get home for a little bit of time, but this needs to be fixed before we leave for Christmas, and then the House can come back in January. They can take up this bill, and we can get it to the President's desk early in February, make it retroactive, and give people relief. This is not about helping out powerful interests and millionaires on the beach. This is about helping lots of Americans that have done nothing wrong, everything right. They've been in their homes since the 1960s, 50s, in some cases from the 1800s, and are going to be priced out of their home and their equity stolen from them by a poorly drafted piece of legislation. We can do better, and we should, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. I rise to address the nomination of Cornelia Pillard for the D.C. Circuit. Thank you, Mr. President. My colleagues, I've enjoyed my time in the Senate very much, as we live in very difficult times politically. There are a lot of influences on individual senators and parties and the body as a whole, so these are very difficult times. I can only imagine writing the Constitution today. I always thought that would be a good Saturday Night Live skit, to go back to Philadelphia Hall and have all the satellite trucks parked outside and the bloggers and the talk radio, moveon.org, you just fill in the blank, putting pressure on our founding fathers not to do this or not to do that. We live in different times. It's absolutely good that people have a voice and influence and create organizations to advocate their cause. There seems to be an organization for almost every aspect of the economy. So lobbying the government, having a say about legislation, trying to push your representatives to do something you think is good for the country is very much part of democracy. But eventually you have to govern. And democracy is a journey, sort of like when you're on vacation or you're driving to a place with your kids. They'll always ask, are we there yet? Well, democracy is not an end state, it's a process. Democracy is really protecting losers, not so much winners. Winners tend to do well in any system. Democracy protects the loser by having a rule of law, a process, that says if you lose the election or you're in the minority in a body, there'll be rules there to give you a voice. I think one of the problems in the Mideast and throughout the world is that people are afraid to lose. In the Mideast, it's a winner-take-all environment. The reason you have so many militias is people don't trust the police or the government to be fair to their sect or their tribe, so they arm themselves, believing that if I don't take care of myself, nobody else will. And that just leads to an endless state of conflict. So democracy is really a process, and it is designed to ensure that losers in a democratic process still have basic rights. You can lose the election and not get fired. It's illegal to fire somebody because you're in the opposite party, unless it's a political job where you expect that to happen. You don't lose your right to speak up because you lost the election. And when you find yourself in a minority in politics, it's important that you have a say, and it's also important that the majority has ability, having won the election, to do certain things, to run the place, for lack of a better word. Now, the Senate is an unusual body in traditional democracy. Parliamentarian systems are different than what we've set up. You have two houses in most places, like the House of Lords. I don't know what power it has, but it's not too great. The parliamentary system is where you have to form coalitions. And at the end of the day, it is a completely different setup than we have here, where the party in charge basically, if they can form a big enough coalition, they can just basically run the place. The House is a winner-take-all body. If you're in the majority in the House, you can decide what bills to bring to the floor, what amendments to be allowed on those bills, how long to debate those bills. You have almost absolute dictatorial abilities to run the House. You determine everything. Minorities have some say, but not a whole lot. And the House is sort of gang warfare. I've been there, I love the institution. You'll find majorities will be fighting among themselves a lot in the House because that's where the action is in the House. I've been in the House and I've been in the Senate. I love being in the House, and I understood the way the rules worked, that if you were in the minority, what came to the floor was determined by the majority. What amendments were in order was determined by the majority, and that's just the way it was. Now, when I was in the House, we would pass one measure after another that would go to the Senate and never be heard from again. And that was frustrating. Until older you get, you sort of realize that maybe some of the things you wanted were not in the best interest of the country as a whole. And the fact that you knew that if it went to the Senate, there would be a filtering process unlike the House, over time has been somewhat reassuring. House majorities are more partisan, generally speaking. They're influenced by two-year election cycles. It's a more passionate body because you're always up for election, and winner takes all. And when you win in the House, the people that got you there expect you to do things consistent with your party's agenda. Nothing wrong with that. The Senate, there's been a conscious effort in the Senate to kind of put some brakes on that kind of way of governing. And when you send a bill to the Senate, you still, to this day, you have to get 60 votes to be able to bring the legislation to the floor to get cloture. And the minority has the ability to say, not only we want the bill to come to the floor with a certain amount of amendments, then you negotiate with our friends in the majority to get the amendments you want and to allow legislation to come forward. And there are probably a lot of times when Republicans in the House voted understanding that maybe this idea won't make it through the Senate, and that was probably okay. Here's what I fear. Ms. Pillard, the nomination, a lot of my colleagues have talked about her being a radical judge and kind of being out of the mainstream. I don't want to get into that. All I can say is that my view of a presidential appointment is for the Senate to provide advice and consent constitutionally required, but to recognize that the president won the election. And the Senate has advise and consent powers, not the House. And I found myself in all kind of judge fights since I've been here. I've been a lawyer before I was a politician. I love the law. The thing I love about the law is that in theory, it's the place where the poorest guy, the most unpopular person can still get a fair shake, because that wouldn't happen in a political environment. It's a place where the richest guy or gal in town doesn't have to pay because they can afford to, only because they have a legal responsibility to. I just love the idea of an independent judiciary, a jury of one's peers, protecting people's interests in a way that politics could never could. I would argue that the strength of the rule of law in the country has been our great saving grace. Elections happen all over the Mideast. Saddam Hussein got 90-something%. I haven't been able to get there yet. And I would argue that electing Saddam Hussein was a joke. It's the institutions of government that really do provide freedom to people. And an independent judiciary has been a godsend to our country. It's not perfect by any means, but it was the courts that basically broke the stronghold of segregation, because politically, I don't know, it would have taken far longer to get there. But at the end of the day, Bush v. Gore, Vice President Gore's maybe one of his finest moments contributing to democracy was to accept the ruling of the court. You know, you fight like crazy, you lose a national election by a few hundred votes, all of your supporters are telling you they did this here, they did that there, and the next thing you know, the Supreme Court rules 5-4, and he graciously accepted the decision. Now, what has happened here is that the rules of the Senate have been changed in, I think, a very dramatic way, first time really in 200-something years, where our colleagues on the other side decided that we would no longer require 60 votes to get a nomination to the floor or approve a judge. Now it's majority rule. Majority rule on judicial nominations except the Supreme Court and executive appointments. And a lot of average people say, wait a minute, you won the election, why isn't 51 enough? My response is this. I think we all understand the benefit of being able to slow things down that may come out of the House, and having to pick up some votes from the other side to get to 60 to pass legislation has probably saved the country a lot of heartache in terms of emotional legislation coming through the House to the Senate that would never make it into law. A lot of things I wanted have been killed in the Senate. A lot of things that I hope never would see the light of day have died in the Senate, so it kind of works out. Now, when it comes to judges, I've tried very hard to make sure that Republican and Democratic presidents are treated fairly. I don't believe it's my job as a United States Senator from South Carolina to vote or block an appointment because I wouldn't have chosen that judge. I remember during the Bush presidency, there was a wholesale filibuster of Bush judicial nominations, and we were thinking about doing the nuclear option. 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans said, wait a minute, unless there's an extraordinary circumstance, we shouldn't filibuster judges. An extraordinary circumstance really is about qualifications or something unusual. I can say to my Democratic colleagues, we've denied 2 judicial picks by not allowing cloture. If advising consent means anything, it means on occasion you can say no. 2. Now, as to the D.C. Circuit Court, this dispute about how many judges you should have on the D.C. Circuit Court has been going on for at least for a decade, ever since I've been here. The Bush administration wanted to add judges to the D.C. Circuit because that's the circuit that all appeals go to where the government regulation is challenged by somebody in the private sector, an individual or in business. If you want to sue about Obamacare regulations or detention policy or the NSA program, it goes to the D.C. Circuit. So every president, quite frankly, would like to have an advantage there because it protects their administration policies. And I guess what I would say is that changing the rules because we've said no to 2 picks outside the D.C. Circuit, I think was just, quite frankly, irresponsible, and it's going to change the Senate forever. As to the D.C. Circuit, you can't say this debate hasn't been going on before we all got here. Senator Grassley's been the most consistent guy in the world about the D.C. Circuit, even when Republicans were in charge. There are more needs out there. Judges, these are fine people. They could be put in other spots where the need is greater. But we are where we are. So our colleagues decided after 2, I don't know how many have been approved, 2 have been denied, enough's enough on the judge side, along with the D.C. Circuit attempt to grow the court there, and that we've had disputes about executive nominations. I remember Ambassador Bolton, you know, Mel Watts, I find, is actually really, honest to God, I like Mel's a great guy. I just don't think he's the right choice for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And to my colleagues here, you're all wonderful people. There's not one person in the Senate I would pick for that job because it has a really technical requirement to it. And so here we are. Now, very quickly, and I'll turn it over to Senator Grassley, what does this matter long term? I think the first casualty of this rules change is going to be the judiciary itself. And here's what I mean by that. Now that you don't have to cross the aisle to pick up a few votes to get to 60 when there's a disagreement, and these are very rare. We don't filibuster everybody. They're fairly rare. You're going to have more ideological-driven picks and judicial nominations because the filtering device of having to at least talk to the other side, once that is taken off, no longer exists, the pressure in the conference to pick the most ideologically pure, hard-nosed, fire-breathing liberal or conservative is going to be immense. So what you've done is you've changed the face of the judiciary probably forever. And shame on you. I think that's going to be your legacy that will stand out long after all of us have gone, because I don't see how you go back and put this genie in the bottle. I just think you're going to find that the judicial selections in the future are going to be the ones that the people who are the most rabid partisans are going to pick, the most faithful to the cause, not the most faithful to the law. And I don't know what it's like on the Democratic side, but I can tell you what it will be like on the Republican side. There are a lot of people out there who have got a list of judges they want to see on the court yesterday. Some of these people are going to be tough for you to swallow. And I'm sure you'll do the same to us. And what you're doing is making the majority self-regulate. There is no longer the excuse, for lack of a better word, I can't push this person through because I got to get some buy-in. Now, those who want to make sure you're picking the best person who's not an ideologue, you're going to have a hard time of it. So I think the judiciary is the biggest casualty over time, only equal to the Senate itself. It will not be long, and I don't know how long it will be, before the rules change for a Supreme Court pick, because there'll be a replacement of several members of the Supreme Court in the next decade. That's just the way life is. And there'll be opposition from the party out of power. There'll be frustration. Somebody will be blocked that makes the party in power mad, and they're just going to change the rules. That's just going to happen. We're now about outcomes. We're not about process. The Senate is slowly but surely becoming the House where winner takes all and ends justify the means. Anything you can do over there, we will do over here. That's just the way it's going to be. And it won't be much longer until you have a Senate and a House and a White House in one party's hands. That happens every now and then. And there's going to be a centerpiece of legislation that's been the holy grail to that party that is an absolute nightmare to the other side, and it's going to pass the House on a party line vote, and it's going to come to the Senate, and somebody's going to get frustrated and saying, I've got 51 plus votes, I may have 57 votes, I don't have 60, and they're going to change the rule on legislation because the pressure to do it, now that we've gone down this road, is going to be immense. So what we've done, and all I can say, I'm by no means perfect, but when this happened on our watch, I tried to find a way to avoid it, but we are where we are. Finally, about Obamacare. Let me tell you from a member of Congress's point of view, something you should consider. All of us are federal employees, and we get a subsidy for our health care premiums like every other federal employee. It's not a unique deal to the Congress. If you're a member of the federal government, you get up to 72% of your premium subsidized. Other employers do that, but it's a darn good deal. It's available to all federal employees. Now, Senator Grassley, again, I want to compliment Senator Grassley, says if we're going to have Obamacare, we ought to be in it, we, the Congress, and our staffs. Well, now, under the law that was passed, I think Senator Grassley was the originator of this idea, members of Congress and our staffs have to go into the exchanges. But we have the ability to go into the D.C. exchange, the District of Columbia exchange. And the law is written such, and every member of Congress who takes the subsidy is entitled to do it. I don't blame you one bit. You have to go into the exchange, and your premiums are going to go up, but the subsidy will continue. Senator Vitter believes, and so do I, that because we're leaders, we should take the road less traveled and experience more pain than those who follow. So I've been of the opinion that if you're going to change this law, that the Congress should not only go into the exchange, we shouldn't get a subsidy any longer. Why? Because most Americans are going to lose their employer-sponsored health care as it exists today. Maybe not in total, but your premiums are going to go up dramatically because your employer cannot afford to pay the increased premium under the old system. So you're either going to lose employer-sponsored health care and become an individual, or you're going to have to pay more because your employer's in a bind. They can't afford the subsidies that once exist because premiums for employers like individuals are going to go through the roof. And I just want to give you an example about what I've chosen to do. I've chosen not to go into the D.C. exchange, but to enroll in South Carolina because that's where I live. Now, enrolling in the South Carolina exchange, I won't get a subsidy. That was my choice. I accept that choice. Why am I doing this? To try to give by example what I think is coming to a lot of Americans in some form or another. So here's what happens with me. Under the old system, I was paying $186 a month. If I went into the D.C. exchange, my premiums would go up, but not great, not a huge amount. But now that I'm enrolling as a 58-year-old short white guy in South Carolina, my premiums are based on the county I live in and my age with no subsidy because I make too much money to get a subsidy. And people at my income level, we don't deserve a subsidy because it bankrupt the nation more than we're already doing if you did that. So under Obamacare in South Carolina, and I chose the bronze plan. Why? It's the cheapest one I could find. You know, I'm not independently wealthy. I make a very good living as a member of the Senate, $170,000, almost $180,000. But at the end of the day, here's what's coming my way. My premium goes up to $572 a month from $186. That's $400 a month, almost 200% increase. Under my old health plan, if I went to the doctor, I paid $20 copay. Under the new bronze plan, I pay $50. Under the old plan, if I saw a specialist, it was $30. Under the new plan, it's $100. My old deductible was $350 a year. My new deductible is $6,350. A $6,000 increase. My old plan had a $5,000 out-of-pocket limit. The new one is $6,350. And you also get rated not just on your age, but where you live. I'm paying $70 a month more than a county that's 40 miles away. The bottom line is what I'm experiencing, a lot of other people are going to experience. I'm paying a lot more for a lot less. Now, how can that be? When you're told that you get more and you pay less, and a politician tells you that, you ought to be very leery. That doesn't work out a lot in my life. You're going to get a lot more, but you're going to pay less. The reason that these premiums are going up is that all the uninsured, and I want to provide coverage to the uninsured as much as anybody else, they get insurance coverage with a subsidy. Well, who's paying those subsidies? The rest of us. So you're going to see next year employers have to back out employer-sponsored health care, either in total or in part. And what you're going to find throughout this country is that people who had employer-sponsored health care, just like the individual markets, their premiums are going to skyrocket. Maybe not as much as mine, maybe not 200%. The deductibles are going to go up, maybe not as much as mine of $6,000. But everybody in the country doesn't make $176,000. So all I can tell you, every member of Congress should look at what would your life be like if you didn't have a federal government subsidy, you didn't roll into the D.C. exchange, you went back home, and you had to pick a plan like everybody else in your state. You ought to sit down and look at what your individual life would be like. And if just look, you'll be shocked. I sure was. And this is really not about me, even though I'm giving you an example about myself. It's about an idea called Obamacare that's going to destroy health care as we know it in the name of saving it and making it better. I think we all agree we need to reform health care, but I think most Americans believe that their old health care system was working pretty good for them, but it could always be made better. So I'll turn this over to Senator Grassley, but I would love to see, Senator Sanders, I'm sorry, I would ask every member of Congress, whether you go into your state exchange if one exists or not, do the math. You're going to be shocked at how it would affect you. And let me tell you, it's going to affect people you represent in similar fashion. So what do? Why don't we just try to sit down and start over and see if we can do better before it's too late? With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, there is a reason why the favorability rating of the